Hey guys, welcome to Priceless B-Movies. I'm going to tell you a little story real quick. Back when I was in 6th grade, I had a really hard time in school, and, a big deal of it was especially math class. And this is for two reasons. One, my teacher was like 100 years old, and I couldn't read for the life of me the chicken scratches she used to put on the chalkboard, so I couldn't remember shit. But also because there was this little asshole always sat behind me, and for whatever, his own boredom, his own amusement, he would constantly poke me in the back or the shoulder all through the class, like he had nothing better to do. And, obviously this is typical among kids, they tease each other and bully each other. And, it's kind of innocent until you piss someone off, because at one point I got so fed up with it that right in mid-poke, I turned around, grabbed his finger, snapped it back, broke it in two places. He went to the hospital. I got like 2 weeks suspension, but you know what? He stopped poking people. I think there's some wisdom to be found there. The Final. So The Final came out in 2010, and it's like the ultimate revenge fantasy for anyone who was bullied in school, which is basically to say like 70% of the population of the United States of America. There's this group of kids, like 5 or 6 of them, and basically for the first 20 to 25 minutes, you see them on like a normal school day, and how just mercilessly they're bullied and harassed by the jocks and the pretty girls, and there's like one of the popular kids that sympathizes with them, but like ultimately does not really do a whole lot to protect them in any way. So after a while, these kids, led by Mark Donato and Lindsay Seidel, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I say led by because they're just basically the two kids in the group who are the most fleshed out as characters. They decide that they're going to go all Columbine on these bullies, but instead of just shooting them, because that would be way too simple, they're going to get their whole class together, chained up in a room, and they're just going to torture them one by one and make the others watch, knowing that their turn is coming. While I can definitely see the horror element here and see that this was a good idea for a potentially very disturbing horror film, the idea of these teenagers, these kids who can't be older than 15 or 16 years old, and they already feel that they've just taken so much crap from life that all they can do is torture and kill these other kids. I think anyone who's really been bullied to an extreme in middle and high school knows what it is to just have this blind fury and frustration and really just want to hurt everyone that picks on them. When you're an adult, you get older, you grow a thicker skin, and you're able to deal with jackasses a bit better. But when you're a kid, you're not. And I, for one, had to deal with that. I, for one, was one of those people who had to deal constantly with bullies in school. Now, not going to say I forgive anything the characters do in this movie, but I will say it wasn't hard for me to side with them. It wasn't hard for me to kind of buy into their hatred and their motivation behind the acts of violence that they perpetrate in the last 2/3 of the film. I'm not going to go too much into the torture scenes in this movie, because that's one of the thrills of watching a movie like this, is to figure out as you're watching it how this next kid is going to meet their demise or what kind of painful ordeal they have to go through. I will say that I did like how most of the torture was bloodless and suggested, and I also liked kind of the psychological aspect of it too. This isn't Saw, this isn't Hostel. The acts of violence and torture being perpetrated against these kids are just as psychological and have just as much to do with the harassment that these kids placed on the outsiders at the beginning of the film. It's very interesting for me to watch the hunted become the hunters, so to speak, in this sense. And I really give props to the movie for those ideas. Also, the kids, like I said, Mark Donato and Lindsay Seidel do a really great job. Some of the other kids don't even really have a lot of lines. So, I just list those two actors because, as I said, they're the most fleshed out. I really like Lindsay a lot. I think she is the high point of this movie in terms of the cast. Mark Donato's okay, but he does go really over the top in some scenes. He's kind of uneven. It's almost like in certain scenes he comes off a little cartoonish for me, especially with the fact that all these kids are wearing costumes because they decide they're going to have this mass torture and death scenario at a costume party. And, Mark Donato's got this gas mask on, and they try to bane the hell out of his voice, and sometimes it's a little too cartoony, and it does distract, at least in my mind, from the tension going on in the film. But at the same time, I understand this is a horror movie, And, just having the genuine thriller idea of having this kind of, as I said before, this Columbine-esque situation, I guess wasn't enough, because it does have to go into horror. You do have to have the masks and the knives and the weird, slasher movie tropes. Also, the ending, I think while you could argue that that was probably the only way this movie could have ended, just toward the last 20 minutes, it just kind of turns into a show of cliches for me. It's kind of like you have this very interesting build-up, and then the payoff, I think, is a little weak. I think I would have appreciated a more intelligent and a more kind of outside-the-box ending than what we're given with the final. But for what it's worth, you could find movies that are torture porn movies, could be classified as torture porn, that are far worse than this movie is. There is one of the torture scenes that I want to bring up, which is a great kind of homage to Audition, which is an Asian horror movie from back in 2000, I believe. And that's one of my favorite horror films. But, if you've seen that, you'll know the scene I'm talking about when it gets to it. It's unmistakable. It's almost shot for shot one of the torture scenes in Audition. I'm a little biased here, but I'm going to give the final 3 out of 4 stars. I do have flaws. I do have bones to pick with this movie in terms of the narrative, and especially how at the end it really does kind of collapse on itself, in my opinion. But getting there is a lot of fun, and I think that, when it comes to these torture movies, and there's a lot of them, and I have a lot of them on my docket that have been requested for me to do, I do have a little more appreciation for psychological horror than I do for just cutting off fingers and burning people just for the shock value. I think that your script has to be smart, and you have to treat the violence with respect in a way. And I think the final does this really well. There's another movie I reviewed a little while back called Would You Rather, and I think the torture scenes in that film are helmed really well. This is kind of along the same lines, but I do like the final a little bit better than that movie. So that's my review of the final. Stay tuned. I got a lot of reviews coming your way. I have been a little busy in my life lately, so it's taken a couple of weeks for these new videos to pop up, but I'm still working on them, and I'm still watching your requests, and I will have more and more reviews, aiming to have about maybe 10 more done by the end of the month, so stay tuned. As always with the requests, if there's a movie that's horror or action or crime, comedy, whatever, that you just think doesn't get talked a lot about, or that kind of went over the heads of mainstream audiences, and you want to know what I think about it, let me know. Leave me a comment. And as always, stay tuned for more Priceless B movies.